Yep. Thank you, Terry.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm so glad you could make it. My name's Terry Diamond. I'm with the Kenai Soil and Water. And this series is is brought to you by a partnership between Kenai Soil and Water Conservation District in Kenai and the UAF Cooperative Extension Service and the Agribility Program. Our main goal here is to support Alaska growers of all sizes and all degrees. So this is a 7-part series, and we have found some wonderful experts, and they're going to be digging into what you can do to get the most out of your land, whether you're a home gardener or whether you are a land development person. There's all different kinds of things for everybody. So I want to introduce Deshauna York. She's the Agribility Director for UAF and Cooperative Extension Service in Anchorage. And she assists clients finding resources they need within the university communities. So she also partners with several other organizations to coordinate a variety of educational opportunities and develop projects that meet our local and statewide needs. So with that said, I will pass it off to Deshauna, and I hope you enjoy the series.
I was muted, so there's an example of what not to do. Make sure when we are in mode of speaking, make sure you're unmuted. So welcome, everyone. Thank you, Terry, so much. As she mentioned, I'm Deshauna York, and I work with Cooperative Extension Service. I am located in our Anchorage office, and I have the distinct pleasure this evening to introduce our guest. And so if you're in the right place, you should be at a session that is entitled Soil Composition and Composting. So it's going to be exciting. We have a great speaker this evening. Her name is Jodie Anderson. She is the director of the UAF Mat-Su Experiment Farm and Extension Center. Big wave. She's located in Palmer. Jodie started her job as director of the Mat-Su Experiment Farm and Extension Center on August 20th, 2018. She provides leadership for the academic research and the cooperative extension outreach programs based at that facility, which is part of University of Alaska Fairbanks. Jodie has a varied background in agriculture and natural resources. She's worked as a soil scientist, which is going to come in really handy tonight for our presentation. She's also researched potato viruses. She's taught high school and college biology, as well as gardening and composting classes. As a doctoral student at UAF, she studied fish waste as an option for composting and soil building. So without further ado, Jodie, take it away. I will actually, I'm sorry, right before you get started, I will say if you have questions along the way, sorry about that, please drop them in the chat, and we will also be pausing throughout to take your questions. All right, Jodie, thank you.
And if you could pop in the chat just to practice where you're joining us from, that would be amazing.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. Super excited to be here and kick off this really cool program series on all the things that you need for growing and success. It's very exciting. And I went through the participants, just eyeballing some names and faces, and I'm really happy to see names and faces that I recognize. So some of you have probably, been involved in some of my presentations before, and so I hope that I don't put you to sleep if it's a repeat, but I'm really excited to be able to do this. So tonight we're going to cover both soils and compost. There's a lot of correlation and connection between the two, and you'll see why. I will pause when we break between soils and compost talks. So if you have soils questions, we'll try to answer those at the appropriate time, and then we'll answer probably composting questions and then everything else at the end. Also, please make sure that you, if you have a question, if you want to ask a question, just type it into the box, to the chat box, as Gina and Deshauna mentioned, and we'll get to those. I will slow down a little bit to breathe every now and then, so that's also a good time to type something in really quick. And I'll try to pause between the big chunks of the talk as we move forward. But we will have time at the end as well to cover things too. So let's do this. I'm really excited to share this with you guys. And today we're going to talk about some real general characteristics and qualities of good garden soil and talking about composting. So it's kind of a two-part talk. What I'm hoping is that, as I say in some of my composting classes, I hope that you learn just enough to become really, really dangerous with all this. The idea is that, you know, the soils talk that I'm going to give you is, you know, a multi-series semester class, and is the composting, but I'm trying to hit the highlights for you, hit the science, so that you understand the why. And I think that that's really important. When people really understand why something is the way it is, they're able to kind of manipulate and play with the system a little better. So we're going to talk a little bit about why today, which is pretty exciting. And I hope that we enjoy it. The soils component tonight, we're going to talk about the three major pieces of soil and the reasons behind those three major roles of soil. So when we think about soil is a living thing. And as DeShanna mentioned, I've taught high school biology, college ologies, all of those, and chemistries. And what was really interesting is as a college undergraduate and graduate biology degree, I really didn't really love, I mean, I've always been a nerd, so there's that. But when I started studying soils, all of the sciences come together in soils. So tonight we're going to talk about the physics, soil physics. We're going to talk about soil chemistry, and we're going to talk about soil biology, because all three of those are integral components of what soil is and does. And keeping in mind that happy plants means you have happy soils. You will never have a happy plant buried in or living in poor soils. That doesn't happen. So when your plants look sad, they're telling you something. And there's probably something in the soil that you need to fix or help amend so that your plant becomes happy again. So it's really, there's so much connectivity between these three components of soil. And again, I'm just going to hit the highlights, but I do want to make sure that we cover the soil physical, chemical, and biological properties tonight, just for enough background so that you get to know what's happening. So before I get started, because I can talk about this for about 12 days straight and not stop, and those of you who know me know that's probably sadly true, I am going to set my alarm at this particular point because I know that I won't stop if given the opportunity. So there we go. All right, here we go. So we're going to start with soil physical characteristics, and we're only going to talk about one. We're not going to talk about the physics of water movement through soil, very important, but we're not even going to talk about that. Really what we're going to talk about is just soil texture. And the reason that we're going to talk about soil texture is because you can't manipulate soil texture. You can't change it. Your soil texture is what it is. Now you can add things to it and change the ratios and kind of move this dotted red circle. If you see this on the larger box, that you can manipulate and change around by adding material into your soil. But the funny thing is that you're not going to make sand turn into clay just because you're trying. Okay, so soil texture it's a property that you kind of have to deal with. Unlike the soil chemistry and soil biology that we'll talk about later, the soil texture is an inherent quality of the soil that you kind of have to deal with. So let's just talk a little bit about that. The photo that I have, the diagram that I'm showing you on the left-hand side of this, the triangle, this is called I know. Scientists come up with very creative names for things. This is the texture triangle. Wow. It talks about soil texture and it's in the shape of a triangle. Who knew? But the really cool thing about this texture triangle is it basically triangulates for you what your soil texture is based on 3 particles. There are only 3 particles that you will find in soils. Your soils either have or and, right? There's 3 particles that are going to be that your soil is composed of: sand, silt, and clay. So sand, silt, and clay are the 3 soil particles that we're talking about. And if you see it on the left-hand side, you'll see that on the right side of the triangle, that's your silt line. The bottom of your pyramid is the sand, and the left side is clay. So sand, silt, and clay. We say it in that order: sand, silt, and clay. Sand is the largest of the 3 particles in your soil. Sand is visible. You can feel it. You can see it. It's there. Sand can range anywhere in size from very coarse sand, which is really almost like a small pebble, to very fine sand. I know. It's, again, keep in mind, scientists are nerds and not incredibly creative. So that continuum of what sand is, it's still macroscopic. Even fine sand, you can see it with the naked eye. Sand, you know what I'm talking about when you're rubbing sand between your fingers. You can feel that. And if you're not doing it right now with your own fingers like this, imagine it in your head what sand feels like when you rub it between your fingers. Sand is the largest of the 3 particle sizes that are found in soils. And if you look at the upper right-hand corner, I have a diagram with a square with blue, and then there's this weird kind of aquamarine or light blue oval. That is basically demonstrating the size of sand relative to the other 2 particle sizes. So sand is the largest. It's macro, you can see it, you can feel it, and it's very important. Sand is so large that it allows lots of pore space in your soils. And with lots of pore space in your soils, what ends up happening is water moves through it very well, in fact, too well. You don't want 100% sand soil. Think about trying to put a garden on the beach. You're just going to be watering 24/7 because that moisture doesn't stay in sand. It just moves right through it. It's very porous. It moves through. The next particle size that we're going to talk about is silt. And in the diagram, you can see these are kind of the darker blue ovals or royal blue ovals. They're the middle-sized particle. If you're playing with soil and you're rubbing it between your fingers or you're rubbing it in your hands, those silt particles are what gets stuck inside your fingerprints. So that is silt. Silt is a finer texture than sand. Many people in Alaska will tell me that they have clay soils, and it's not clay. It's silt, in fact. Silt can be so small and lock in with each other that you don't get good water movement through it. You don't have a lot of pore space, sometimes with some silts. For most of us in South Central Alaska, our soils are predominantly silt loam. And the reason that we call them silt loam is because the loam is that dotted dashed line there in the middle. That's kind of the happy place. Loam is kind of the perfect combination of sand, silt, and clay that really allows structure, but also allows water movement and nutrient movement through the soil. And so a loam is the goal. In the valley and lots of places in Alaska, we have what's called silt loam. That just means that there's a little bit more silt than everything else. And it's a good combo. Still an excellent garden soil, farming soil, growing soil. And because of that, it's kind of the envy of all gardeners in wherever you garden. Loam is kind of that ideal soil because it has it's a good combination of the 3 soil particles, and it kind of robs all 3 really great qualities of those particles. So the sand is the largest, and it allows lots of porosity. Silt is the second size. It's in the middle between the largest and the smallest. And silt is going to allow for some reduced pore size. So it's going to hold the water a little bit better. And silt is going to hold some nutrients a little bit better. So you've got sand, silt, and clay. Clay is the end result of weathering process. And weathering is exactly what it sounds like. As soil, especially like sandy soil or silty soil, rocks, for example, as they weather over time, you end up with clay. Clay particles are super fine. You guys can see those little tiny dash marks. Clay are huge. They're just so important, but they're so tiny. They're just super fine. In fact, they're so fine that they actually can form a water barrier. It will not let water through a thick clay. And so that's why we use clay for ceramics and for pottery. When it dries, all those clay particles form this tight network that don't let water through. Try thinking about a pot made of sand. Probably wouldn't hold the water that you wanted to drink from it. So clay has super, super fine, very thin particles. Clay, if anyone's ever visited the Southeast United States, the red clay of Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, what's going on is that those clay particles that you're walking around on in Eastern, North, South Carolina, Georgia, those particles used to be the Appalachian Mountains. So think about, like, over time, the Appalachian Mountains used to be just like the mountains in Alaska. Very, very jagged, very rough, but they've basically broken down. They've been weathered over time. And as that happens, it washes those clay particles toward the ocean and down onto the plains of the southeastern United States. So you have that really thick, heavy red clay. Up here in Alaska, our soils are way too young to have huge clay deposits like that. We do have some clay locations, but predominantly soils in Alaska are not heavy clay soils. They can be heavy silt soils because of our glacial work, but you're not going to have heavy clay particles. So here's how you tell. Go out into your yard next time it's thawed. Go out into your yard and grab some soil, right? And you just rub it between your fingers. You're going to be able to feel the sand roll in your fingers. You're going to be able to see the silt in your fingerprints. And the clay, good luck feeling the clay. No, the clay is going to feel almost kind of greasy, which is really cool. So how do we know this, Jodie? What's going on? Let's be German soil scientists for just 1 second. I want you guys to think about this. I want you to picture in your head a soil scientist who doesn't rub their fingers together to do soil texturing. They put the sample in their mouth. What, Jodie, that's gross. No, we can't do that. Actually, German soil scientists are taught to do soil texture in their mouth because their tongues have way more nerve endings than your fingertips do. So your tongue's more sensitive than your fingers. So here's what happens. I want everybody to just, in your brain, I want you to go to these 3 places with me and travel with me for just a sec. 1, let's go to a beach. Just go to a beach, go to a sand beach, stand there, put sand in your mouth and run it around. Are you guys feeling that? You feel those sand particles? They feel like boulders rolling around inside your mouth. They're huge. That's sand. That is sand. Now you got it. All right, now spit that out. Spit that out. Now, here's this one. I want you to go to the dentist. Oh, remember the dentist when you come out and you just had your teeth cleaned and you have all that grit in between your teeth, and the whole way back home or back to work, you're kind of doing that number to squish all the grit out from between your teeth? That's silt. Are you feeling that? Are you feeling it? Do you have that sensation? That's silt. You don't get sand. Well, you might get sand particles in there. And if you do, you probably should go back to the dentist because your gaps are way too big. But the silt is going to wedge right in here perfectly. Now, clay. How are we going to tell clay? I'll tell you how we tell clay. We're back in kindergarten and we're playing with clay, not Play-Doh, but clay, right? Like real clay. Put a little bit of that in your mouth. And you know what happens? It coats your mouth. How do I know this? I read it somewhere. Anyway, it coats your mouth. And you know why it coats your mouth? Those particles are so super fine that they form almost like a single layer and they cover the inside. They coat the inside of your mouth. And so it feels kind of slick in there. Sand, pebbles, silt wedged in your teeth, clay, a slimy film layer. You need all three of those in your soils because you want clay and you want things to hold that water. You don't want just all sand. You want silt and clay and sand to form that really nice kind of trinity so that you get water moving through your soil, but not through like that fast. You want it to move through that fast. Because when we talk about soil and we talk about texture and water moving through the soil column, what we're also talking about is your nutrients, because almost all of your essential plant nutrients are moving in that same water as it's moving through your soil. So you're going to spend all this money on nutrients and have a heavy sandy soil and all those nutrients go flush. And you just lost all that money and your plant's like, I'm still really hungry. So you need that loamy combination to allow for the water and the nutrients to both move through at the right speed. That's soil texture. Very critical, very important as we move forward. Now, I'm not going to stop at this point. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next one because this is where everyone's going to ask me questions anyway. Soil chemistry. I'm going to nerd you guys out right now. You're just going to be like, I'm going to go back to college and I'm going to study chemistry because this blew my mind. You can tell me that later. It's okay. Here's what I want to tell you. The biggest bang for your buck in terms of soil nutrients is don't go out and buy a soil amendment that has an N, P, and K of blah, blah, blah. No, don't do that. It's expensive, it's heavy, and therefore it's even more expensive with travel and shipping and all the things. But you know, the biggest bang for your buck is bring your pH up. For most of us, we have acidic soils. I was looking at where people are from, lots of Anchorage people, some Valley people, that's awesome. Lots of Kenai people, awesome. Most of us have acidic soils. And when I talk about acidity, I'm looking at pH. And when I talk about acidity, the pH scale measures that. And acidity is anything from 0 to 6.9 is an acid. From 7.1 all the way up to 14 is a base or alkaline. And right at 7.0, not 6.9, not 7.1, but 7.0 is neutral, okay? Look at the magic red dotted line, just like in the last graph that I showed you guys. The dotted line was the magic zone. Check this out. Same here. This red oval, dashed oval, is showing you that anywhere between about 6.2 and 6.8 pH is ideal for almost every vegetable and plant that you want to grow in your garden or your field. I mean, it's just that simple. And here's why pH is so amazing. I want you to look at pH 5.0. Okay, so that's on the left-hand side of this graph that I'm showing you. This is called a pH and soil nutrient availability graph. That's what this graph is. You can Google that and you'll find 100 iterations of what I'm showing you right now. None of them are this beautiful, but that's okay. You can look them up and you'll find something that maybe makes more sense to you than this. But I want you to look at 5.0, pH of 5.0. As you go down, the very first line you run into is nitrates. That purple line, look how narrow it is. Here's the secret I'm going to tell you. When the pH is 5.0, you can have this much nitrogen in your soil, but only this much is available to plants. So the pH locks up nutrients and make them unavailable to plants. Has your mind blown yet? It's okay. You don't have to agree or disagree with me. It's just truth. It's amazing. So at 5.0, which, by the way, I will tell you, there are valley folk out here that if we go out and test the pH of their soil, it'll come up at about 5 or 5.2. No lie. So we look at 5.0, there's barely any nitrogen, there's barely any potassium, there's barely any calcium. If any of these sound familiar to you, they should be familiar. These are plant essential nutrients. And already they're so limited. But look what is available. Aluminum, that's a metal. Iron, that's a metal. And those two metals actually do damage to plants. And with a low pH, they're more available. Oh, that's not good. You don't want that. Look at my magnesium, my sulfur, my molybdenum. All of those things are limited in a low pH setting, but my manganese, my zinc, my aluminum, my iron, oh, we don't want too much of any of those guys. And yet there they are, sucking it. The plant's just like, oh, I guess, I don't know. That's all that I've got. And everything is fighting for the good nutrients, N, P, K, calcium, magnesium. I'll tell you one thing, when you put bacteria that are living in the soil naturally, who also need all of these nutrients, N, P, K, calcium, right? Magnesium, sulfur. The bugs in your soil need these exact same things. And if you put the bugs on one side and plants on the other, fighting for the same thing, guess who loses every time? Plants lose. Bacteria and fungi that are already in your soil are going to rob your plant available nutrients for themselves to do their job in the soil. And your plants are going to lose every single time. So the biggest bang for your buck to bring your soil nutrients into some sort of usable level is raise your pH. Bring your pH up to 6.5, 6.6, 6.7, even 6.4 would be amazing. Because you can bring your pH up, and it's slow, it takes time. You add lime to your soil. Dolomitic lime, for example, is a lime that has magnesium as well. And you can add that so your soil gets magnesium and the calcium carbonate that it needs. If you go into a box store, a big box store, I won't name names, but you guys know what color of stores I'm thinking of right now. If you walk into one of those stores and you just walk in the front door and you say to whoever in whatever color apron or shirt that they're wearing, says, "Can I help you?" And you say, "I'm looking for lime." And they send you over to the masonry section where there's all the concrete, walk away and go to the gardens, okay? Because there is another type of lime that's called slack lime. That is, no, that's actually, that's not gonna help your plants, it'll kill them. So walk out of that section of the giant box store and walk over to the garden section. Lime will naturally allow the soil pH to move up, and when soil pH moves up, the nutrients that have been locked up become available. It's just like that. It's amazing. So pH is critical when you're talking about gardening. And I have lots of people who say, "Jodie, I'm not going to spend $18 on a soil survey. That's crazy. $18. I don't want to do it." And I'm like, cool, I get that. I hear you. However, with that same amount of money, you can actually buy a bag of lime, and for the next couple of years, slowly add it, keeping in mind that this spring, the lime you add on your soil this spring, you will see the benefits of it next year. Okay, so this is not a quick fix. Nothing in soils is a quick fix. If it is a quick fix, it's not really a fix, right? It's a crutch, and you're not fixing anything. You're just holding it over until it explodes later. So keeping in mind that this lime addition is going to be a slow fix, but it's going to be an amazing fix, because if you can shift it, you can release nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, sulfur, and now I don't have to go to the store and buy soil amendments. Huzzah! I've saved money, and I didn't have to get a soil test. Well, it's because most of us have acidic soils, and the best and first thing you should do if you have a new soil patch is add lime. Work it in. You can get lime in powder form. You can get it in pelletized form. You can even get it in small chunks, like kind of rocks. Remember that the more the surface area, the faster it breaks down, meaning the powder will break down the fastest, but most of us also live in wind tunnels, and putting on powdered lime becomes kind of a messy ordeal sometimes. So just keep in mind where you're spreading it, how you're spreading it. And if you are spreading it as a pelletized product or as a clump, right, as just a chunk, it's going to take longer to break down. So you're not going to really see those big results. You won't really see big results next year, but it may take even 2 years longer to move on. This is critical. If you guys can nail this, you're just golden, absolutely golden. So this is like, it's so critical. And really quickly, I just want to say that when we're looking at soil nutrients, there are 3 types of categories that we look at. We're looking at macronutrients, the primary macronutrients, N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And if we're thinking about a farm that has acres, we're talking about semi-loads of this material, semi-loads, to get you the right amount. And Alaska is very nitrogen limited soils naturally. So pretty much you're going to want to add nitrogen no matter what. However, if you bring that pH up and you add some nitrogen, boom, boom, it's a double whammy awesomeness. Secondary macronutrients are, if you, again, think about an acre of space that the whole acre you're growing in, you need a pickup of this material. And this is calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Sometimes if you buy a bag of amendment and it has 4 numbers on it, it has N, P, and K. They're always in that order. And that fourth number is usually sulfur, S. Keep in mind, if you add sulfur, you are going to be dropping the pH slightly. Those of you who want blueberries and haven't been able to grow them very well, your soil probably is too high a pH and you want to drive it down. So instead of adding lime to that section, add sulfur to that section of your soil. The sulfur will drive your pH down. The lime will drive your pH up. You can also use wood ash if you wanted to use it instead of lime. However, cautionary on wood ash, one, make sure it's good, clean wood. Don't use any pressure treated lumber. And two, that wood ash, make sure that you're using twice as much as you would for lime. Okay, so you use twice as much wood ash as lime. Micronutrients. This is a really hairy conversation. And the reason I say it's a hairy conversation is imagine an acre of growing, right? You've got an acre, you're producing on 1 acre, and you learn in your soil results, ooh, I need to add boron. You're going to add the need to add, we're talking sometimes less than a teaspoon on an acre of land. Micronutrients are called micro for a reason. You don't need much. And here's the really horrible part about micronutrients. When a plant has what it needs, it's happy. La la. If the plant has too little and that line is super fast, it crosses into, I have a deficiency in boron. I might die. Oh my gosh. Get it to that happy zone. But then if you get just a little too much, it's toxic. There's a fine line between deficient and toxic when it comes to micronutrients. So if you have even an inkling of an idea that your micronutrients are off in your field, in your garden, in your orchard, wherever you're growing, consult somebody who knows a little bit more than Google. Just do that for me, because you can actually destroy an entire growing area by adding too much. I know a gentleman who he was told he needed boron. And yes, we are boron limited in Alaska because boron is derived from rocks breaking down. And I told you already, we're really young. We're a very young state. We don't have a lot of rock breakdown yet, young geologically speaking. So when we look at that, we don't have a lot of boron. So he was told, oh, you're going to need boron for your acreage. He bought a 50-pound bag. I said, dude, you can take that 50-pound bag, you can give 10 pounds to all your friends, and you're going to be left for the next 50 years with an 8-pound bag of boron that you're never going to use. Okay. Also, you can use borax, the detergent. It works too. All right, I'm going to stop right here. And I see there's 12 different things in the chat. I haven't kept up at all. Are there any big questions to Shanna that I can answer to deal with texture or nutrients at this point?
There was a question about wood ash and you answered that. Are there some fine grained limes that are also fast acting?
Most of your limes are there's nothing, when you talk about lime, there's nothing that's fast acting, because think of the volume of soil that you're dealing with, and you're really putting on like this much lime, right? So it's got to get in, it's got to break down, you got to let the bacteria and do its thing, and it's not going to be a super quick response with lime, no matter what you do. Sorry.
And then a couple other quick things here. Can you do too much lime, and what happens?
You could theoretically do too much lime and you'll notice it because it gets really cakey and it won't break into your soil. So just mix it in really well. But for the most part up here, you can't do too much. And if you have done too much, you'll know it because it won't break apart. So as you add it, mix it in the soil really, really well and keep it within the top 6 inches. Don't go any deeper than 6 inches down.
Another quick question that's really good is, what's the best method for pH testing soils in your home garden?
Excellent. You have to send it away. The soil testing kits, I'm just going to use air quotes, testing kits that you buy at whatever store anywhere, are horrible. They're inconsistent, they're unreliable, and they're not going to do any good. Seriously, sending it away to a lab that calibrates their machinery, and that they're always doing that, you're going to get both accurate and precise response measurements. And then that's what you can use later to figure out how to fix your Lyme.
Great. That looks like we're rolling. Other than
Awesome.
that, people made some other interesting comments, but yeah, thanks.
Interesting
People,
comments.
you're
Okay.
pumping people up to get started for spring.
Right on. Well, that's the whole point, right? Isn't that what we're here
Yep.
for?
Absolutely.
Now we're going to move into the coolest part, because soil's alive. Dirt is soil that's in the wrong place, right? You're out in your garden and you're living that soil. And when you come inside, it's dirt on your floor, right? Dirt is misplaced soil. Also, technically, dirt is not alive. Dirt is not a system. Soil is an entire system. And systems are super complicated. They're very complex, and they have all these moving parts. And because of all those things, what ends up happening is that just like on a food web, when you pull one little string, all these other things get pulled with that one little tweak. So when you look at soil organisms are breaking down organic matter that's in our soil. Soil organisms are basically cycling nutrients. They're bringing in nutrients into their body, they're breaking them down, they're changing them, and then they're releasing them, or they're breaking themselves down and are being released, and those become plant available, which is part of that whole cycle. And it's absolutely incredible. Bacteria and fungi are your two biggest workers in your soil. Bacteria are eating the really simple sugars, the easy carbons that are right there. If you're doing green manure, so you're growing a cover crop and then you're tilling it in, that's called a green manure. That is a very nitrogen rich, easy carbon source, and the bacteria eat that up like crazy. And the fungi, not so much. Fungi, on the other hand, are crazy for the super chewy, woody carbons, right? They're gonna love like all that straw material that you left on the field, and then you till it under in the spring, and the fungi are like, we'll do this. Now, bacteria are like your sprinters on your high school track team. They're the super crazy, super fast, get it done and we're out, right? Oh, over. And your fungi are like your long distance runners. They're like, they're in it for the long haul. They're gonna sit, they're gonna break that carbon down. They're like, give me some time, I got this, and they break it down. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, in a forest with lots of woody material, like leaves and very ligninous, heavy carbons falling to the surface and working into the soil, that ratio has high fungal populations and very low bacterial populations in a forest soil. On the other hand, in somebody's garden, it's totally opposite. You got heavy bacterial populations and barely any fungi. And the reality is, a really properly living, healthy soil has a really nice balance of both. So you want to make sure that you're giving your soil the right foods. I know this sounds weird, like you're feeding your soil, but that's what you're doing. And we'll talk about that when we get to compost. Hint, hint, pay attention. But these bacteria and these fungi are working together to make your soil the right environment for all the things to happen for plants to grow in. And so it's this soil food web, for example, which is what I'm showing you here. That is a healthy soil. The better that that bacterial and fungal population ratio is, kind of the more even it is, the more healthy that soil is. Here's another, and this is, I apologize, I didn't realize this was such a crappy picture I took from a book, and I'm sorry, but I can't find this anywhere else, so I have to use it. And it's such a cool thing. I want you to think about a soil column, right? Just a core of soil. And I want you to think about it about 1 inch wide. So we're thinking about a 1 inch tube. Every 4 inches of that 1 inch, as we go down from the surface, like just below all the root material, then go down and down 4 inches. Every 4 inches, you lose a 0 of your populations of organisms living in that soil. For example, you can get up to 5 million different organisms living in that top 4 inches. This isn't 4 inches, by the way. It may look like it on your screen, but in reality, I'm not showing you 4 inches, but 4 inches, we'll do that. 5 million critters living in there. Most of them are microscopic. But as soon as you drop to that next from 4 to 8 inches below the surface, you've lost an entire 0 on that first number. You're now looking at 500,000 organisms. Go from 8 to 12 inches lower, you're looking at 50,000 organisms. You're losing a power of 10 every 4 inches you drop in the soil. This is what I show you this picture for all of my tillers, for all my deep tillers. When you till deep, especially below that 4 inch line, you're bringing all of the bugs that are used to living in that one zone into a zone they're not used to, and they won't survive. So you're actually messing up the bacterial soil web, the fungal soil web that your soil is. And they're like, but Jodie, how do I plant? And I'm like, well, that's a great question. So one thing you can do is there's these really cool diggers where they have tines and you stick it in and then you twist it, right? If you guys have seen these, they're like little like weed devils or something, what they're called. I can't remember what they're called. But anyway, garden somethings, I don't know. Anyway, but they have handles, you step on it and the tongs go in the soil. And all you're doing is you're breaking the soil up, but you're doing it this way. You're not flipping it over like a tiller. You're just mixing it side to side. So that 5 million stay 5 million. They may not be at home anymore, but you haven't thrown them into the abyss and they haven't died. So think about that when you're turning your soil the right way. Okay. All right. Bacteria, fungi, soil food web, they make your plants grow. Literally, they are the ones that make your plants grow. All right. Now, Deshanna, let's figure out where are my soil questions, and then we're going to move into composting because I gave myself an amazing segue. What's up?
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so we dropped in a few resources. There were some questions about, soil testing. So we dropped in a publication on how things to consider for, laboratories, and also how to do soil sampling. There was a question that's pretty specific about, to basically taking samples for 100 acres and how to go about doing that. So I included the publication reference. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but kind of process for that. But the publication talks about taking different segments in different areas. I think we're good. Folks had just asked a few questions. Oh, how does this factor impact planting bigger plants that go past the 4 inch?
That's good. That's a great question.
It is a good question.
Yeah, and when you do that, I know it isn't perfect. It's not a perfect world. We're going to disturb that soil, but just the awareness that instead of like, I have many friends, and when they plant things, they start with a hole about this big around, right? And then they plant in the little plant this big, right? And so it's like, ugh, did you really need to destroy this much? Like, keep in mind the size that you're trying to get and try to hit that size. You don't need to make it the size of your yard just to plant that one tree. You can actually do it. And also, in all honesty, most tree roots and plants that are that are perennials in Alaska actually have incredibly shallow root systems because our soils are too cold. So even after, I don't know, I'll say, for example, a giant windstorm in the valley last week, when you see huge cottonwoods tipped over and trees that generally have tap roots, like your spruce trees in the lower 48, look at how they fell. And when they fall, instead of a root ball, they have a root wad, and it's this flat like disc that just kind of lifts up on the soil that's connected to that. It's because those roots only go so deep, and then they're like, oh God, it's so cold, and they start growing like that. So we end up with root systems that go out this way. So oftentimes you can actually plant a little bit more shallow than you might be used to, and anticipate that they'll go ahead and grow that way. You can also plant shallow and then pile dirt up around them, or soil up around them. You could do it any of those ways. But those 2 publications are excellent to shadow. That's a really good call. Thanks for sharing.
How about
those.
one last quick question? Is it a bacterial imbalance when there are parasitic nematodes, pests in general?
It could very well be. It could be a water issue. You may not have enough water moving. You may have too much, too great of a water load or a saturation. So that could bring them in. It could be a lot of different things that are in there. It could also be an imbalance of your good nematodes, because you have good nematodes that fight the bad nematodes. And so yeah, there's a lot of different things. As a friend of mine once said, Jodie, I hate asking you questions because there's never a yes or no answer. I'm a biologist by training, so there's always an exception, right? So there is no right or wrong answer there. There's lots of things that could contribute to it. So just work on developing that soil health. All right, composting. Like, according to this, I have like 15 minutes left. Is that right, Deshana? Can I keep time?
You're good. I'm also watching the time for you, so you're fine. Go ahead. I'll let you know.
Well, no,
You're
I know,
good.
but I'll back myself right up into slide 2, and then we will be done. So
yeah, you've got
anyway,
about 15, 20.
All right, cool. So composting is zookeeping, right? So I don't know if you guys ever want to be a zookeeper, but you can have a compost pile and you're a zookeeper, because we're going back to bacteria and fungi, right? Remember what I said about bacteria and fungi, right? So a compost pile is a zookeeper's dream, except that you have to sell microscopes along with the tickets to the zoo for your friends to see what's going on. You are trying to feed bacteria and fungi the right amount of food in the right environment so that they do your job for you and they decompose. So composting is a natural biological process that is manipulated by humans to make it go faster, stronger, better. Okay. Decomposition is happening across the surface of the world right now, but it happens in a very thin layer and it happens very slowly. Humans do things faster. So we take all of the junk and we pile it in a big pile, and then we let it decompose fast. Go, go, go. That's India to get rid of human waste, because there was so much of it. They're like, what? I don't know what to do with it. And they watched as the piles would slowly decompose, and they're like, what? Composting started there for that reason. Not saying that's why we're doing it today. I am saying the same principles are involved in composting as are in decomposition. Here's what you need. You need nitrogen, and you need carbon, and you need oxygen, and you need water. You just need 4 things. So composting is just like cooking, right? You find a recipe and then you tweak it and it becomes your magical recipe. And everyone thinks that you're a magician because you figured it out. And it's just because you practiced it long enough and you figured it out. So by doing your homework, following a recipe, figuring out what your feedstocks are. Feedstocks are the raw materials that you feed into your compost pile. You need carbon. Let's talk about these. Carbon, oftentimes we talk about carbon as brown material, but please don't get hung up on color. please don't, because I'll tell you why in a second. But brown are carbon-rich things. Remember, the woodier the carbon, right? The chunkier, the woodier, the more lignin, the more dense that carbon, the longer it's going to take to break down in your pile. So make sure that you have some easy carbon too. Not necessarily sugars, but to the bacteria, it's kind of like sugar. So things like things like straw and newspaper and shredded paper and brown paper bags, and shredded cardboard works great. And then as soon as you start getting into the more woody things, those are going to take a little bit longer to break down, but that's okay, because in the recipe that I'm going to recommend to you, you need 3 parts, 1, 2, 3 parts carbon. Wait a second. Yeah, that's right. Sorry, I just got totally. But you need 3 parts carbon to every 1 part nitrogen. And I say parts because some of you are doing backyard composting. So you're going to have buckets. And some of you are doing farm composting, and you have front end loaders or pickup trucks or wheelbarrows full. So when I say parts, you need 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So if you have, let's say, a bucket of kitchen scraps, that's 1 part nitrogen. Now you need 3 parts carbon to mix with it, because you need to feed your bacteria that are doing the work for you, and they need that ratio to be happy. They need the carbon because carbon, just like for humans, carbon gives us energy. We use oxygen. In the presence of oxygen, we break down carbon, and that gives us energy. It's called respiration, cellular respiration. We are working in aerobic settings, aerobic meaning with oxygen. We're doing this in a setting where we want oxygen involved because you get a cleaner product. And you need the bacteria that you're feeding, and eventually the fungus that you're feeding, need those carbons for energy, just like we do. That's where we get our energy in our cells, is from carbon. Now, as those bacteria are breaking down that carbon, eating the carbon, they're like, yeah, carbon. They need to grow. And what makes them grow is the proteins in their bodies, and the proteins are in their cells. And the proteins are, that's what's nitrogen. That's the nitrogen base. So 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Nitrogen oftentimes are green products for your compost pile. It doesn't necessarily have to be green. In fact, one of the best nitrogen sources for a pile are coffee grounds. You heard me say it, coffee grounds. If you can get a hold of old hay or straw from a farm somewhere that you know, and old coffee grounds, and you do a 3-to-1 ratio, you're going to end up with pretty magical compost in about 90 days. Coffee grounds? But Jodie, they're brown. How are they a green? It's because they have nitrogen. They're a nitrogen source. So we call them a nitrogen source. That's why I don't like brown and green. However, if you use leaves off the tree, you pick the leaves off the tree and put them in your compost pile, they still have nitrogen in them. They have chlorophyll. That's why they're green. They're nitrogen rich. They would be a nitrogen source to your compost pile. However, if the leaves die on the branches, fall down, and you rake them in the fall time, which you really shouldn't just leave them on the ground, let them break down. But if you want to put them in your compost pile, then you classify that as a carbon source, and they're a carbon source. 3 parts carbon, 1 part nitrogen. You need to water your pile as you build it, and you need to make sure that it can get oxygen moving through it. So to do all those things, we turn our piles. Look at this nerdy graph. Oh my gosh, I love this graph. Here's what I want to show you on this graph. Do you see at the base, that's your time, right? It's in days. on your axis, this is your temperature, and this is in Fahrenheit. And you notice within the first like 5-6 days, the temperature is almost at 140 degrees. It's going like, wee. This is because you have built a pile, you added water, it's in the presence of oxygen, there's tons of food, and the bacteria that are already in place. You don't have to add bacteria to your pile. Magically, they're already where they're supposed to be. They're just gonna be like, oh, this is the best place I've ever been. And they're just gonna start eating and eating and eating. And as they eat, they get really, really energetic. And as they get energetic, they start moving and doing more and more. And the temperature of your compost pile increases. Has nothing to do with the sunshine, has nothing to do with anything, but the energy, the heat energy produced by the bacterial and fungal populations in, and predominantly bacterial, at the beginning of your pile. And they start going up, wee, and then all of a sudden, look what happens at about day 6. It starts to drop, and not drop gently like a lovely, ride at the amusement park. Oh, yay. No, this is abrupt and deadly. You get to the top and it's crash. At that point, when the temperature just plummets, that's when you turn your pile. What? I know, right? Because here's what's happened. Your bacterial population has basically eaten themselves out of house and home. And as soon as that happens, they're like, well, I'm out. I'm done. Ugh. And there's no more energy, there's no more heat. Your compost pile temperature starts to drop, and it starts to drop pretty quickly. That is when you turn your pile. And when you turn it, you're adding new food sources, you're mixing it up, you're gonna water your pile when you turn it, you're adding a flush of oxygen as you turn it, and all of a sudden those bugs are like, whoa, yeah, and they do it again. But notice this time they don't get quite as hot as the time originally. And as you keep turning your pile, every time the temperature starts to crumble, you're slowly composting. Well, you're not. Let's keep in mind, you're not composting. The bugs are doing the work. But as you turn the pile and you feed them and you get them stoked, and then they start to cool down, and you turn the pile again and they cool down. Notice at the very end, you turn your pile and the temperature doesn't go up at all. You're done composting. Here's a hint. Everybody wants to compost super fast. They want to do it yesterday and they want to put it on their garden tomorrow. That's composting, right? So here's some, I'm just going to throw some real down on you here. It's going to take time to compost, but the more you babysit your pile, the more you watch its temperature, literally take its temperature in the center of the pile. For my super technology nerds, you can actually, honestly, Bluetooth a temperature probe that you put in the middle of your pile to your phone and totally nerd out at work all day long, checking the temperature of your pile. Oh my God, it's at 122 today. And if you really babysit your pile and you watch, as soon as the temperature starts to drop, you turn it immediately, you're gonna finish your composting before, say, me, who builds the pile, gets totally stoked, 10 days later, checks the temp, it's already started dropping. I turn the pile and then, oh, life. And then it's time to fish. It's fishing season, and I'm gonna go fish. And then it's time for moose. Yeah, and then you got to finish and harvest and wrap everything up. And then I've got that meeting, and then I got to go to that place. And then all of a sudden it's frozen and it's November, and I turned my pile once. Do you know why compost is so glorious? I mean, there are multiple reasons, but the biggest reason is it never dies. You cannot kill a compost pile. Trust me, I have tried, and you can't do it. If your compost pile today is sitting in your backyard and it was a cold pile of goo in the fall time, and now it's just a frozen pile of weird, and then in spring when it melts after breakup, it's now a really cold pile of goo, rebuild it and it will work. It's amazing. You cannot kill a pile. The number one problem that I have when people call me with haircuts over the phone, you guys know haircuts over the phone? Haircuts over the phone look like this. Hey, Jody, my compost pile isn't working. Okay. Well, what's wrong with it? Oh, well, I don't know. You're in Galena. I'm not really sure what's wrong with your pile. Well, what is it? It's just not working anymore. What do you mean not working? Well, it's not hot. Oh, okay. Reach in the middle of the pile and tell me what it feels like. I'm not gonna reach in the middle of the pile. Just do it. It's just your trash. Just reach in the middle of the pile. It's organic goo. It's gonna go on your garden eventually, so just deal with it. Reach in the middle of the pile. You tell me what you feel. Hey, Jody, I felt in the middle of the pile. I mean, it just feels like a pile like wood and stuff. It's really dry and whatever. I'm like, you need water. Water your pile. 99% of the time, my haircut over the phone calls about compost, the pile's too dry. For real. A few years ago, and DeShanna will remember this, and those of you in Anchorage might remember this if you've been around long enough, the Muni gave out composters, right? They gave out these composter bins, and everyone's like, yay, free composters. And so people were like, yay, I'm gonna put stuff in a composter and I'm gonna turn it. It's gonna be awesome. And I'm gonna have compost, like shake, 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 compost. Well, here's what happened. People were putting all of their kitchen scraps into their compost turner. And how much carbon were they putting in? Wait, what? I have to put carbon in that too? No. I just put all my kitchen scraps and then I turn it. Oh, Jody, this stuff stinks and it's wet and it's slimy and it smells horrible. Well, then add carbon to it. What are you talking about? I just use my kitchen scraps in my turner. No, you need to add carbon in your turner because 3 parts carbon, 1 part nitrogen, right? It's just that simple. Composting in Alaska can look crazy. It's everything. I have literally seen it in a kiddie pool. I've seen beautiful piles of it that's turned with machines. I've also seen my friend in Galena, literally in the bottom left-hand corner, she stacks everything in a big pile, turns it all with a pitchfork. She has the most amazing gardens I've ever seen, and she builds her own soil using her compost. You guys, it doesn't matter what it looks like. However, once your compost pile starts, don't keep adding to it, right? Well, I take out a bucket of kitchen scraps once a week and throw it into my compost pile, and I don't ever get it finished. Well, it's because you're starting your compost pile brand new every time you add to it. So now you're at day 0 again. And next Friday, when you bring out the stuff, you're also going to be at day 0. So let it go. If you want another pile, build another pile. Start building up your feedstocks and build another pile. But you can't keep adding to a pile and expect it to just magically turn into finished compost. It's not going to happen because you're a zookeeper. For goodness sakes, treat your animals the right way. Give them carbon, nitrogen, water, and oxygen, and that's all you need. That's it, guys. My
Awesome.
email address is there. Yes, I do work in Palmer, but I've helped people across the state. If there's anything that I don't answer tonight, if there are any questions that you have, please feel free to reach out. In this photo, in the upper middle, you'll see what looks like a trash can with holes in it. And that's interesting because it's a trash can with holes in it. That is a compost vessel that I created. Wow, Jody made something. Yeah, I did something that could be done in a rural community because everyone can find a 33-gallon trash can somewhere, or at least something similar. And I drilled 3/4-inch holes with a hole drill, just a hole punch, every 4 inches all the way around, including the lid. And it was great. I made really nice compost with that using fish and rotten hay. So
Nice.
What's up, Deshanna? What questions?
Yeah, so we got a few other questions, and actually that like last slide here kind of answered one or two as some thoughts, but a couple questions. Are there limitations on coffee grounds that you can use, such as flavored coffee grounds? So for the folks who get a hazelnut, what do you think?
Go for it. All coffee grounds. And in fact, here's the fun part. You don't have to scrape it from the filter. The filter is going to be just a little bit of carbon. Chuck it right in the pile. Don't separate it.
Gotcha. We had a guest join us, Janice Chumley, who answered one of the questions in the chat, which is exciting. There was a question about hay treated with broadleaf herbicides. It can negatively affect compost and later your garden. Does it stay in the soil of the hay field for a number of years? Can it affect runoff water? So Janice threw out some thoughts on that. I don't know if you want to touch base on that one as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
This question just I'll just hit that with a quick. I'm not going to even come close to Janice's expert world of you know, pesticides and the work that she's done for years on the Kenai. But I will say that when you build a compost pile, it's just like building a garden. Know what your inputs are. If you're comfortable using them, then go for it. But there are some things to keep in mind. For example, if you're getting horse manure from your neighbor, right, and your neighbor just dewormed all their horses, that dewormer, that chemical is going to be present in the manure. And then you put that on your garden, there may be some bugs in your soil that aren't going to be super happy. And so again, the same with pressure treated lumber, stay away from it. Know your sources. Okay. If you get grass clippings from your neighbor, do they clean up all the dog poo before they cut their grass? Do they spray pesticides on their grass in the springtime? Weed be gones, so that they don't have to worry about weeds. Like, know your source as you build your compost pile at your level of comfort. And so I've had people who tell me that they won't use cardboard that has colored dyes on it. That's cool. They just don't feel comfortable with it. Technically, I mean, they're fine. They're okay to use. They will not harm a compost pile. But if that's something that you really don't want to do, it's your pile. Don't do it.
Cool.
But do know your sources.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm kind of at the last slide here. Someone asked, what do you think of cylinder composters? Do you follow the chart for temperature days for when you turn the cylinder composter?
Yeah, I do with cylinder composters, and like the composter that I developed with the trash can. It's the same idea. Always take the temperature from the center, and as you see that temperature start to drop, that's when you turn your compost. This was a very easy compost to turn because I just put a tarp out, tipped it over, dumped it out, spread it around, watered it, piled it all back up, threw it back in the tumbler, and put a lid on it. So it was pretty nice.
Yeah, so someone said every 5 or 10 days turning the perfect world, but ultimately you talked about the temperature being crucial. So
it is the temperature, and it's not, it really has nothing to do with the number of days. I've turned one compost that I did with fish and hay, at day 12 is when I turned it. And some composts, you end up having a crazy bacterial population that on day 6 you need to turn it because they've already eaten through their source. So again, as I've said, I can't answer a question yes or no. It always depends. And so temperature is what is the turner, not the number of days.
Gotcha. Because all questions are good questions. Do I pile up my scraps and carbon until I have a heap and then I mix it up to start the composting? Is that
you can do that? Right? Absolutely. Yeah, I highly recommend that you make sure that you got all of your materials when you make your pile. And because I've seen people who are like, I'll just pile my 1 part nitrogen and I don't have quite 2 parts carbon, but I'll get that other 2 and the 3rd part later. Yeah, we all know what happens later. So they have this weird, wonky, imbalanced pile that dies very quickly. And when I say dies, it just doesn't stop. It doesn't work anymore. So they just have to fix their balance back to 3 to 1. And that's not perfect. Some of you guys are going to find that your feedstocks, that you've got a very, like a really easy carbon source and a really nice chunky nitrogen source. And you need maybe less carbon and the same amount of nitrogen, or sometimes even more carbon, because it's a really big nitrogen. It just depends on what your pile does.
Gotcha. So someone said they had not heard that you could add meat to the compost, such as fish.
So yeah, there are a lot of kind of composting 401 level things. Generally, the biggest push behind not adding meat into compost piles is because you really have to watch your carbon ratio to make sure that your pile doesn't smell and attract, let's say, oh, I don't know, stray dogs, random dogs, your dog, bears, foxes, and all the things, and even ravens. So having that ratio is going to keep the smell down quite a bit as well. And so a lot of people, especially to beginners, do not recommend adding meats and dairies to the pile, just because they tend to break down rather quickly and they smell pretty strong. And if your pile isn't balanced right, everyone's gonna know it. A good compost pile should not smell at all. It should smell
Good to
like
know.
earth.
Cool. So if someone was interested and they've played around with composting, do you recommend any good resources for learning about making or using fish fertilizer, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, one of the best, I mean, certainly our cooperative extension service does have a couple composting publications, but in fact, the best research that's being done at land grant universities is at Cornell University. So that's the land grant in New York State. Cornell has an entire waste management program in their cooperative extension service. And so they have an amazing resource wad of materials, videos, publications, books, all the things. And I would highly recommend, if you're really interested in composting and are a reader or a watcher, check out Cornell University and then just look up composting in that search category, and you'll find some really great resources as well.
Cool. So what are you doing with the potatoes in the picture?
I'm composting them. And so I'm watering them with fish goo. That's a very scientific term for fish goo. And so these are, this is liquid that was from a fish processing plant. And in that liquid, there are organs, heads, and frames, and pink fluffy goo. It was awesome. And those are wasted potatoes. We gave these were potatoes that we were doing research with, and we had so many, we gave so many to the food bank. Finally, that fall, the food bank was like, we don't even have storage. We can't do this anymore. We gave as many as we could away, and so there were just a few left, and I was like, let's compost them. And so you can see me watering them with a bucket, and then in the bottom left-hand corner, we're watering the pile before we cover it. And that thing got up to 135 degrees in November. And then it snowed on it, and the snow melted right off the top. It was awesome.
Amazing. Was it steaming in the winter?
Yep. It was
cool.
sexy steaming.
Nice. There are a few other questions about what fish parts you can, and do you blend them? You kind of mentioned that.
Nope, all of them. You know, I used heads, frames, guts, in the composters, the blue totes, right? The blue composters that I made. And when I first turned the pile, all I had in that 12 days, all of the soft bits were gone. And all that was left were bones. In fact, the bones were split apart because even the cartilage had been broken down already. And yeah, at the end, there were some bone pieces that didn't decompose, but you can put that directly in the soil, or you can sift it out and then throw it in your next batch of compost. So it's
great. So if you hold kitchen scraps till you get the correct ratio and they mold, can you still use the kitchen scraps?
Sure, you can. I would say if you can, try to freeze things as you collect it, or put it in some sort of protective thingy that you're not getting grossness in. Yeah, but I mean, you can still use it. The mold is just it's really, you're just kind of pre-decomposing it already. and you could choke that in the pile and it'll get eaten by the bacteria actually.
Nice.
Yeah.
I've got about 5 more minutes, so there's some more questions here if you're game, Jody.
Sure, have at it.
When adding in the winter, when everything's frozen and mixing of the matter, can you add in the winter, or can it just mix it up when it thaws? So you kind of talked a little bit about that. You could just let it sit and then just let it rip when it thaws out, right?
Yeah, for real. So if your pile freezes, especially that core, that center, that's really where the activity is. As soon as your pile freezes, it's kind of done until springtime. And if you have a large enough pile, like say, for example, those windrows that you see on this photo, or if you're a farm and you have like daily manure addition, you know, like kind of thing, and you have an unfrozen pile, you can work with that pile and turn that pile all winter. It's going to continue composting at the same rate, as long as you've got that critical mass so it doesn't freeze to the core and that core stays thawed. But otherwise, if it freezes, then just let it go. Maybe in the springtime, add a little nitrogen to it, and turn it, water it, make sure it's watered because it'll be really dry in the core. The outside's gonna be wet, but the core can be very dry. And then just turn it and you're gonna be good to go. It's gonna kick right back up again.
Cool. I love this one. For our techies online, what Bluetooth device do you recommend for compost temperature monitoring on your phone?
You know what?
That's awesome.
I don't even know, because I use my hand. Like, this is free, and so I just shove that thing like I'm birthing a cow, like right to the center, and I feel around. And if it's, you know, you're looking at a temperature of anywhere between 120 and 140 degrees, you're going to know that when you put your hand in there. Plus, you can also tell how moist the pile is. If you come out and you've got water dripping into your armpit, it's too wet. Add more carbon. Because remember, if you've got too much water in your pile, all those pore spaces, just like soil, are now filled with water, not oxygen. So you're creating an anaerobic, a not oxygenated environment. And then you've got totally different critters that we're dealing with. We don't like them. So you don't want to super saturate your pile. You want it to be moist. You want to be able to, I said moist, you want to be able to squeeze it. It holds together, but a little water drips, but not to the armpit. So if you're too wet, add more carbon. If it's too dry, add more water.
You don't want to drown your zoo, huh?
No, your zoo needs to stay afloat.
Gotcha. Our coffee grit. So our coffee grounds acidic. Will they affect the pH of the soil? No.
They won't. The really cool thing about a compost pile is no matter really, because of the chemistry of decomposition, whatever your feedstock started with, your final pH of your compost is really not going to be that dramatically different. So even like I've had a lot of people say, well, I've been told you can't use, you know, coniferous wood in your compost pile, like wood chips or sawdust from conifers, because it's going to affect the pH, and your pile is going to work, and it's not going to really be a negligible pH change in the end. So it's okay.
Gotcha. So kind of a specific question. I'm trying to amend the soil on my farm. I have 200 plus tons of cow manure every year. Wow, cool. Better to spread it or compost it in a pile first?
So great question. And it depends. Oh, I did it. Oh, I had to, I'm sorry. So
again,
it really depends on your soil structure. If you need long-term organic inputs, then I would highly recommend composting it and then adding it for a year, and then go back to just a manure application. With that manure application, what you're doing is, I mean, because you're going to have carbon in it as well, you're going to end up with a very high bacterial population, a very low fungal population in your soils. So by adding compost, you're going to allow that woody material that is that end result of compost, that organic material. Your fungus is going to, all of the fungus in your field are going to come out of the woodwork, no pun intended. And they're going to break down that compost material, which is going to increase that population. So you're going to end up with a better balance between your bacterial and fungal populations. But I would say it really depends on what your soil study says and what your organic percentage is. If your organic percentage is anywhere between 0 and 5, then I would highly recommend composting it and adding it as compost the next year.
Nice. A couple other last quick. Can you use pig manure?
Sort of. It's not as awesome as horse or as cow, but it's certainly it's okay. There are a lot more disease potential problems with pig manure. So I would say if you can avoid it, to try to, but it's still compostable. You just have to be really careful with it so that you're not passing along those really nasty bugs.
Gotcha. Our finale question before we kind of just remind folks of next week. The question is, why don't the potatoes sprout and grow when you compost them?
It's a really great question. So because the way we built this compost pile and because of the temperatures that we got them into, we were able to basically destroy the potatoes before. This is also fall time. So we heated these up to basically 140 degrees for multiple days, turned the pile and got it back up to 140 degrees again. And there's really nothing left of the potato at that point to grow in the springtime. So it's a matter of temperature. And some of us grow potatoes in our compost pile because our compost piles kind of are warm-ish and they don't really get hot because we're not feeding it correctly. We're not a good zookeeper. We're a good zookeeper. We're not a great zookeeper. And so because when those get warm, they get just warm enough, not even over 100 degrees, that the potatoes are like, oh, this is perfect. And they just woo and grow like crazy. So it's a hot compost pile, a well-built, well-working compost pile. You won't have things growing out of it, including weed seeds, because you've killed them with temperature.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jodie. Well, I just dropped a link in the chat for folks to for an evaluation. We'll also send that out after this session with the recording of the session. Terry, thanks for making that note there. Several people have asked if they could get the recording. The question was also asked about your slides, Jodie, but the recording will go out. Folks will have access to it for 7 days, and we can also get you some other information. Just as a reminder, next week, same time, we will have another session, which will be a beautiful follow-up to Jodie's awesome information. It's on biochar basics and enhancing soil nutrients. So we'll have Art Nash, our energy specialist, who'll talk just briefly in general overview of what biochar is, if you're not familiar, what makes up biochar and what the components are. And then we're going to hear from a local farmer in Homer, Don McNamara, along with his partner Donna Ray, but primarily Don McNamara is going to talk from Oceanside Farms about some of the processes that they're using on their farm, which includes biochar as well as indigenous microorganisms, or IMOs. Sounds a little freaky and geeky, right, Jodie? So
it's
come back.
amazing.
Yeah, it's going to be great information to follow up what Jodie told us about the basics this evening. They're also going to talk a little bit about their process they're using of Korean natural farming in their farm. So come back next week, join us to hear about that and also hear about some practical application from those folks out of Homer. We look forward to it. If you have any other questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. There'll be a couple of us that'll stay on for a few more minutes, but otherwise, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. You're able to see the chat, right, Jodie? Folks made some comments there. You see those? I can't hear you, but I'm hoping you're reading the chat.
I'm just starting to look at it. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, good. No problem. No, people are just thanking you for your entertaining and expertise approach to composting and soil. We appreciate you taking the time this evening to join us. It's important information and entertaining and important though. I like the zoo. Managing your zoo. That's what we should have called this.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a specific
There's a
type of
3 to
pile?
1. Did you see the 3 to 1?
The kill
3 to 1
weed
ratio
seeds?
by weight.
Mhm.
Oh, sorry, I was just playing up top. A specific temperature pile to reach to kill weed
Kill weed.
seeds. Anything over 135 is beneficial if you can get it to. The EPA requires a compost to sit for 3 continuous days at 137 degrees before it can be okay to use. And that's because it kills all of the bad things, pathogenic bacterium and weed seeds. So that's kind of the thing to shoot for. It's hard to do as a home composter because we're not talking about a, kind of a critical mass that you need to keep that much heat. But it can be done. This is another reason why they don't recommend putting meat in your pile, is because most people don't get their piles hot enough to kill off the bacteria that's the bad bacteria. So for kind of a pathogenic and safety concept, you do need that super hot, up to 140 degrees 3 times. Yeah. What do I suggest for lazy composter? It's called, I don't know if you've ever seen, no composter is a lazy composter because you put a pile together. So you win right there. But, oh, I'm glad you felt empowered, Karina. But a lazy composter is just someone who builds a pile. Like, for example, I mow my yard and then I take my clippings and I put them in a pile. And then the next time I mow my yard, I put the next clippings in a pile and I keep piling them up. And then eventually I start noticing, wow, that grass clippings pile is getting smaller and smaller. It's decomposing, it's composting, and it's got all the things it needs. It's just going to take a longer time because you're not manipulating it. And because of that, if you have a pile in your backyard that you've been piling onto for years, like grass clippings, for example, that's the most common example. So I use that example. But if you've got a pile of grass clippings, you just keep adding to, and you're like, this pile is so huge, I'm going to start a pile over there. So you start adding to a pile over there. And then 5 years later, you go, oh, that pile is barely there anymore. Go dig to the center of that pile, and that's going to be beautiful compost right there. That is a lazy composter. And you're really still not lazy because you're still piling it up.
Cool. It's still working, even though you're not even looking at it, right?
It's because it's a natural process. So you don't
Right.
even need to do that. Yeah. Someone is asking, Mitzi was asking, is there a municipality that has community compost access? I know that Gustavus has a community compost situation. Fairbanks composts, it's biosolids. Kodiak was composting their biosolids for a while. And I don't know if they're continuing that process. And other communities looked into it, but it's a really hard, it's very time consuming because someone needs to take care of those piles. So it's hard to find a municipality that's doing it and doing it well, unfortunately, in Alaska.
Yeah, and Anchorage is, keeps trying. They keep going back and forth on trying to get it rolling, but it's
exactly.
Yeah,
And Maureen, I totally agree with you. I too am leery because who knows? And that's the thing, is that if you just have a pile where people dump stuff, you have no idea what's going into it, and inevitably there'll be trash that's not compostable material. And so there you need a babysitter. You need someone who, on Wednesdays and Fridays stands there while you bring in a bucket of nitrogens, and they go through the whole thing to make sure that you didn't forget the wrapper that was on the cheese or whatever. And it takes a lot more time than people think. And so it's a really hard, it's a hard sell in a community system.
Makes
which
sense.
is a bummer because it'd be perfect, but
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Jodie, thank you so much. It's always informative for sure. And not just entertaining, but also informative. So thank you. Every time I listen to you, I learned something new and I took notes for my own use. So thank you so much. Is my
Maureen,
centipede
can
looking
I
critter
really-
beneficial?
Yeah,
Yeah.
can I ask just Maureen, if you would send a picture to our IPM people?
And I'll put that link.
Yeah, thank you, Deshanna. I'm not a bug person, but we have people who do that for a living and they're amazing. And they would be the best to be able to let you know if that's a good guy or a bad guy. Probably guessing it's a good guy if I had to, but don't say that I did it. Yeah, they aren't sexy, but they certainly are helpful most of the time. They're also soil turners. They are part of what keeps some of those holes happening in the soil. So they are beneficial in that way. They're just ugly. So Keto just got a grant to compost 2,000 pounds of compostable waste for use. What are you guys, Terry, what are you guys using for your carbon source?
So I don't know for sure. They just got it. They're looking to keep it out of the landfill.
Mm-hmm.
So it's being done through the organization called Kenai Change and Cook
Yep.
Inlet Keep. And so they just got it all approved. So
Wow.
I'm not sure. It's just in the works right now. So it should be interesting. I'm sure it'll be a really interesting thing to watch. Cook Inlet Keeper is probably, if you go to Cook Inlet Keeper and then compost, you'll find more information on it. So
And
it's a pretty
check in
exciting
with
thing to
Robbie.
keep all that garbage out of the landfill. So
No, that's awesome.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, just looking at the 3-to-1 ratio, you're talking about 6,000 pounds of carbon with that 2,000 pounds of nitrogen. And
yeah,
that's a lot of material to try to
yeah.
house somewhere, turn somewhere, like all those things. So that's great. I hope it's awesome.
It looks like they're collecting it. So Diamond M Ranch is involved. A
Okay.
couple of different people are involved. Yeah.
Yeah.
Should be interesting to see how that all turns out.
Cool.
So
Awesome.
yeah, it's pretty cool.
Nice. Cool. Well, I don't see any other questions, and I know we're over time for those who wanted to hang out. This is the after party. The after party with Jodie.
The after
We should have
party's always
added
the
extra 30 minutes for the after party session after. I'm going to start adding that to some of these series.
Sure.
That's not a bad
Jodie,
idea.
that was awesome.
Yes,
Really
thank you.
great.
Yeah, of course. Thank you guys. I had a blast. So.
All right. Well, we'll see you all next week. Maybe Jodie, you can jump in and join us if you don't have something else going on.
Oh yeah, I don't know, but Don and Donna Ray are my favorite humans on earth. And
They're awesome.
what Don is, well, what they're both doing, but what Don's doing with biochar is just magical. And the fact that he's just like, I don't know, I'll figure it out. And he does, and it just works. And they call me and they're so funny. It's just like this random call. And I'm like, I love you guys. And they're like, hey, I got a question. I was watching this YouTube with this guy in Australia, and it's just these random questions. And I'm like, I don't think the chemistry works on that, but here's my thought. And then we just like hash it out together, and it's hilarious. Yeah. I love them so much.
Yeah, I love the fact that they're just, trying new things, innovating, right? Innovating on site.
Yeah,
for sure.
Absolutely. And
So
it's an
cool.
amazing site. So I'm glad that you guys got them to do some talks. That's great.
Yeah, it'll be fun. They're both of it. Donna Ray, of course, is like, well, Don's the one who's, this is his thing. But they're great.
So
they both
she's
chime
like,
in.
I don't really know about it. I'm like, shut up, Donna Ray. So
right. She does. Yeah, they're doing great stuff. So cool. All right. Well, thank you all who are still here for joining. Jodie, it's always a pleasure, and we'll be in touch. And Gina, thank you for all your help. And Terry, I will be in touch.
All right. Sounds great. Thanks, you guys.
Well, yep. Bye.
Thanks. Have a good night, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.